Bonjour. Hello.
Hello.
Do you still want to test, Annemieke?
Yeah, why not? Share. Share.
Yeah.
Share. Oh,
You never know.
you never know. But even if you test it, well, I can see it.
I can see it too.
Good.
Seems to be
Oh, I
working.
see a typo. Oh, there.
Very good.
At least it wasn't your name.
Okay, well,
I've done that before.
your own name or my name? Or
My
both?
own name on my PhD defense.
Ooh, okay.
Thankfully, my supervisor caught it before I presented, but
Yeah,
it was pretty funny.
yeah. Let me add this confidential. Okay. Okay, I will stop sharing. No, I would.
So you made it home.
I made it home, but it was like so. There's a less trains between Schiphol and Hoofddorp. So
Oh.
fortunately, I planned for 10 minutes, but then I needed that.
Well, in general, the trains are quite right.
Yeah. I mean it.
Think
It
they're
worked, but mm.
Oh, in general, we give people 1 minute
Yeah,
extra to enter the webinar.
yeah. I
It's
get
like
it.
1 or 2 minutes past
Yeah,
the hour. Just
but
you know how it goes.
I know how it goes exactly. I'll dismiss all the reminders. I'll turn off my Outlook. I'll turn off my WhatsApp. Nothing that can make a noise. Now, Yuzo can make a noise, but
I was gonna say, where is Yusuf?
no, she's over there. I can see her. You cannot.
Maybe we are lucky.
I hope she screams.
She will probably. But she has a new coconut now. So she used to have one.
Oh,
But so you bolt it to the cage, but that thing had broken. So then every time she went in it, they were like, well, okay, you need a new one. But
no.
the new one, in the old ones, he goes into the front, and the new ones, he has to go into the side. So
Oh,
that's, of course,
that's scary.
yeah. I think now she's going in there, but it's not really convinced
That's funny.
that this is the way it should be.
Well, she needs that to lay her eggs, so she better get brave.
Maybe she should just stop laying eggs, but
That would be ideal.
yeah. Oh, thinks he's gonna sleep. Which weather-wise I can also understand because it went from gray to slightly less gray to now more gray again.
Oh,
Oh, and it's dark very early, right?
Yeah. It never really gets light. Like there's no blue
Yeah,
sky, no nothing. Okay. So we now have a clock that makes bird noises every hour, different birds.
Nice.
So obviously that is something that will draw Yuzu out to.
Every hour has its own specific bird sound,
Yep.
and it's like always the same, or is there's like variation? That's
No, so every like the 12 is an owl, and then there's a cuckoo, and well, but I think it should be silent between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. But it's silent between other hours, so during the night it will still.
So funny.
But I think it's time to start.
Okay.
You give the introduction, Aaron?
Sure. Great. All right, well, I guess we'll get started then. So welcome everyone to today's OTS webinar. Our speaker, I'm sure you recognize, it's Professor Annemieke Aartsma-Rus from the University Medical Center in Leiden. She's an expert on many, many things, Duchenne muscular dystrophy being one of them, but she's also involved in several organizations and has many roles within academic publishing as well. And so today she'll be talking about how to review a scientific paper. And so I'll hand it over to her to introduce herself a little bit more and also get started in the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. So I'll share the screen again and make it full screen. There we go, and give myself a pointer. There we go. And can we hide this as well? Hide video panel. And hide. There. So I now only see my screen. So if there's something going wrong, then please shout, because I'm not seeing you. So I was asked to outline how to review a manuscript, and that is what we're gonna do today. And here's some credentials. Like Erin said, I'm gonna introduce myself. I have expertise with Duchenne and with exon skipping using antisense oligonucleotides, and since 4 years I also have experience with the N-of-1 antisense oligonucleotide therapy development. And I think, well, if you want to review paper, you should have at least written one paper. Well, I've by now written many, which means that I've gone through the review process many, many times as a first author, a co-author, senior author. So I've seen all these perspectives. And I have also reviewed a lot of papers, probably 3 to 4 per month since 2005. So I have been on the writing end, I've been on the reviewing end, and I'm now also an editor for Nucleic Acid Therapeutics, so the Journal of the OTS, but also for the Journal of Neuromuscular Diseases in the muscle space. So I've really seen things from different perspectives, which I think helps to give this introduction to how to review a paper. Some of the things may be super obvious, but some of the things you might not have realized. So bear with me, and there will be time for Q&A and anecdotes at the end. Now, why would you even review papers? Because it takes time. Why would you waste your time on doing this instead of doing experiment, writing your own paper, writing grants, etc.? Well, I think we know the peer review system is not perfect, but it does help to improve the quality of scientific publications, because peers, people who are experts in the same field, they check for the quality of the content. Is the rationale, does it make sense? Were the methods done well? Is the conclusion correct? And also, as a side benefit, they can check whether there's any small mistakes, like a figure that's not referred to in a manuscript, or, well, they refer to figure 2, but they mean figure 3, things like that, that are, well, good to sort. And ideally, you see it yourself. But of course, we all know that by the time you submit it, you immediately spot the first mistake. So that's how it happens. And then the reviewers can help you to point those mistakes out. So it does take time, but it also allows you to see work and results before they're published. And I think that is nice because you might see work at conferences as well, but of course at conferences, you don't have the opportunity to really dive into the data, dive into the methods, see how things were done, etc. So it really gives you, say, a sneak preview into work that you probably are interested in anyway. Another thing is that because when you review papers, you learn how reviewers read papers. And then when you write your own papers, you know, okay, but I'm now writing it as an author, but I know how the reviewers look at it. So this will allow you to read your own work through the reviewer's eye, as it were, and then improve your own writing skills and avoid certain caveats that, well, if you're a reviewer, you will pick up. The review, so if a journal asks you to review a paper, obviously that paper is confidential. The editor will mention this as well, but I want to stress it as well. It's often okay if you have a colleague who's in the same field, working at the same institute, to say, well, can we do it together? But usually, if you want to do that, you need to discuss that with the editor. And definitely what you shouldn't do is share the results with third parties or discuss what you read on PubMed or on Facebook, things like that. The content is confidential until it's published, and then of course it's public. So when should you say yes? If there's no conflict of interest. So this is of course the challenge. If you're an expert, then it's possible that you will know the authors. And you might actually be friends with them, or they might be your ex-colleagues, or you might have been their supervisor, or they might have been your supervisor. And you might have collaborated with them, or you might still be collaborating with them. That makes things challenging. And I think especially when you're in the rare disease field, like some of us are, the challenge there is that almost everyone is collaborating with everyone. So if they say, well, you can't have collaborated with anyone, then they won't have good reviewers. So then, well, say no conflict, no interest, as they sometimes say. However, if you're really good friends with someone, then the question is, can you still do a fair review? And the way, so looking at it from my editor perspective, if people say, well, I am collaborating with this person on something else, but not on this, can I still do it? Usually what I say is, do you feel conflicted? And if reviewers say, well, I think I can do a fair job here, if they don't feel conflicted with this, then I think, well, then it's okay. You have to be an expert on the topic, and the fact that you are asked to review a paper doesn't necessarily mean that you're an expert on that topic. Do you think you're an expert? And of course, expert, again, is a very flexible term. But I'll show some examples where the editor said I was an expert, but really I was not. You need it's not fair to the authors when someone reviews the paper who's really not in that field, because there's no way that you can do a fair job that way. You might make really weird suggestions, you might draw wrong conclusions. To do a fair review, you need to at least understand the topic, have worked on the topic, etc. As I said, it takes time to do a review, and what editors have a really hard time finding reviewers. But what editors hate the most is when the reviewer says yes and then does no. Because then you're waiting for the review. Usually they have 2, 3, 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, they say, well, sorry, I don't have time. I thought I had time. I don't have time. Then you need to find a new reviewer who then still has 2, 3 weeks. And that delays the whole process. So say yes when you can commit the time. And of course, if you're more busy, then that means that you cannot commit the time. And that's also fine. Just be honest to the editor. And of course, depending on how busy you are, but also depending on how appealing the paper is, you will say yes or no. So this is what I mentioned. So I've pseudo-anonymized them. There's one journal, I will not mention the name, that excels at just sending whatever is submitted to them to me, claiming that I'm an expert. So I got asked to review identification of common gene signatures between a gene, and cancer patients via integrated multiomics and network-based approaches. I don't work on cancer, I don't work on gene signatures, so I have no clue how they came with me. Overexpression of, again, certain genes in certain types of cell carcinomas, diagnostic and prognostic implications. Again, no clue how they came with me. Factors associated with a biomarker level in Mongolian patients with a rare disease that was not Duchenne. Again, doesn't make sense. And so you see here these examples. The thing is that the editor claims that I'm suitable to do this review, but I look at it and I say, well, why should I have a look at this? There's nothing sensible that I'll be able to say about these manuscripts. So then there's also no way that I'm gonna spend time on this, and also it's not fair to the authors that I would review this. So then what does the editor expect from you when they ask you to review? They ask, or they hope that you will check for flaws in the hypothesis, in the methodology, in the result, and then does the text match the figures? I mean, look at the figures, draw your own conclusions, and then say, well, how do they describe it? Do you agree with what they describe? Do you agree with the analysis? Do you agree with the conclusions that they draw? Were all the relevant papers cited that should be cited? Were there critical experiments that were not done? Are there any gaps? The small typos that I mentioned already. Sometimes phrases can be really confusing, and then you might not understand, or you might think, well, I think they mean this, but the way it's written now doesn't make sense. You can make suggestions then. And it's also okay to outline expertise that you do not have to the editor. So for instance, if they ask me to look at a paper for exon skipping for disease that I'm not familiar with, I can say, well, look, I'm an expert on exon skipping, but not this disease. So, I mean, I can say whether the work on exon skipping that they did, whether that was done well, but whether that's relevant for this disease, that I do not know. And especially if there's a specific technique used or statistical analysis done, you can say, look, I know some basic statistics, of course. I hope we all do, but this specific technique or this specific statistical analysis method, I'm not an expert for. And if the paper really critically depends on this, then of course, the editor needs to find a statistical expert to have a look at that. So you also, well, so what does the editor not expect? They don't want you to be unrealistic. So the authors decided that this is the story, this is where we end, and everything else is beyond the scope. Now, if there's a one experiment that can disprove the hypothesis and they've not done it, that's an obvious experiment to suggest. But you should not suggest all the future experiments to be done before the paper can be accepted. Maybe if it's Cell, maybe if it's Nature, something, yes. But if it's Nucleic Acid Therapeutics, with all due respect, you should be fair. Is this enough for the publication? If it's enough, then don't suggest all types of extra experiments. Only suggest the experiments that really are needed for the publication. Be fair. So you're anonymous as a reviewer, but that doesn't give you the right to be unfair, to be unprofessional, to really do personal attacks. And I think what people who've written publications, sadly, this happens. Some reviewers really are not fair and very unprofessional. Don't be like that. Just be nice, be constructive. This is this is not your paper, so if you're a co-author and you really don't like the writing style, you can say, well, you can rewrite it, you can make suggestions. This is someone else's paper, so if something is unclear, you can make suggestions, but you should not rewrite the whole manuscript. What you also should not do is suggest, well, you've now done this. You've done this mouse experiment. You've looked at this, but I'm missing this one experiment. Please redo the whole 1-year mouse experiment and analyze also this. That's just not realistic. The authors are not going to do it, and just doesn't make sense. What you also should not do is say, well, I have 5 papers. Please cite all of them. Of course, if you're an expert in the field and there's a paper that you published where you think, well, they should cite this because this is relevant, then by all means suggest it, because you are asked as a reviewer, because you're an expert, ideally the authors acknowledge that as well. So if they miss an important paper from you or from others, you can point that out. But like be reasonable there. You should not have that the authors then have to make a special section in introduction to cite all the irrelevant papers that were suggested by the reviewers. So then more into the nitty gritty, how should you review? You start with the title. And I think so, of course, the title, you see it at first, but also look back at it after you've read the whole manuscript. Is the title a fair summary of what was written? Is it not overpromising, especially if it's in therapeutic approaches? Is it realistic? And is it not over extrapolating? And well, from the Duchenne field, what we sometimes see is that people found something in a cultured cell model, in a 2D cell culture, and then they will have a title, a new therapeutic approach for Duchenne is on the horizon. Well, the fact that you've done something in cells or in animals, that doesn't mean that this is on the market soon for Duchenne. It takes years of extra publishing, extra experiments. So is it fair? Is it realistic? Are they cherry picking, etc.? So this is the first thing that you look at, but then also you look at it again after you've read the manuscript. The abstract. So the abstract usually is something that you will have seen already, because the editor will provide you with the abstract. And then based on the abstract, you can read, well, does it make sense that I can review this, yes or no? If you're doing the exact same thing, probably there's a conflict. But if you read it and you think, well, this looks really cool, this is very interesting, I'm able to say something about this, then you can say yes. But also here, after reading the manuscript, you can say again, is this a fair summary of the result or not? And well, if you're on social media, you probably know Oded. He has a lot of these memes about science, and this is, I think, a typical one that we sometimes see: the abstract versus the result. So we have here a dinosaur cat that is described as a dinosaur cat in the abstract, but then when you look at the result, you see that it's actually something else. So it's okay that the abstract doesn't contain all the nuances of the results. That's fair, but it should be realistic and not overpromising. So then you look at in the methods. Are all the experiments that are shown in the results reported? But also vice versa. Sometimes you see things in the methods where the authors later decide, well, we're not going to discuss this, and then they forgot to take out those experiments from the methods. So see whether it matches. What is described in the methods, is that shown in the results? And is everything that's described in the methods shown in the results? If there's animal studies, and it's really important to see whether authors describe the sex, the husbandry, the numbers of animals that they use, blinding, wild type controls, etc. If there's limitations to model systems, these should be described either in the methods or in the introduction or the results. And ideally, of course, people take along positive and negative controls. And really with the methods, there should be enough information in there to redo the experiment. It's not a protocol, of course, so you don't get all the nitty-gritties and things, but there should be enough in there that if you want to, you can redo the experiment. Then the results. In the introduction, usually there will be a hypothesis. Check whether the experiments are done to test the hypothesis and not just to prove the hypothesis. So did authors also think, well, if it's wrong, if my hypothesis is wrong, then this is how I can show this. So did they really do that due diligence? Do they interpret results properly? So look at the figures. Sometimes people will just be excited about slight changes, and if you read the results, it's like really great and it works so well, and then you look in the figures and you see minor changes. Well, that's just not how it should have been written up. And also, do the conclusions then fit with the results? So do the authors draw the proper conclusions? Are there things that the authors overlooked, experiments that they didn't do, or interpretations that they didn't do? And do the statistics make sense? So did they use the right statistical tools? Things like, well, if they didn't check whether there was a normal distribution, then they might not be able to use certain tests and things like that. So again, an ODAT meme. So are the studies done to test the hypothesis? And of course, this is a correlation versus causation. This cat didn't induce this crater, but there's a lot of science done in this way where the people see, well, we see A, we see B, they coincide, so A must have caused B. That is, of course, not per se how things work. More work is needed. Now, briefly, something about the importance of references and using the Duchenne examples that I'm most familiar with. Because in Duchenne, we have a mouse model, MDX, and then there's tons of different types of treatments that have been tested on these mice. And here we see an example where, well, the authors have used the MDX mouse and then they've treated it, and then they say it improves. Now, the challenge I have with this conclusion is that the wild type is missing. So how do I know that 5 is worse than 8? Maybe the wild type is at 0, and maybe actually what they've done is making it worse. So that's one thing. But if I add the wild type, you will also see there's another reason why it's important to show the wild type. So the treated mice do better. So actually it goes in the right direction if you compare it to the wild type. But you can also see that when you add the wild type, that the treatment effect really was quite minimal. And well, probably we've all seen this. People say, look, it goes from 5 to 8. There's a 60% improvement. It sounds really good if you say it like that. But what we see here is that actually, if you compare it to where the wild type is, this improvement is rather trivial. So check that authors use these wild types, and of course also make sure that they use the untreated controls. So for the conclusions, I said already, are they based on the results? Do they make sense? And then in the discussion, usually when you read it, you can already think, well, this is something that I hope to see in the discussion. So make these notes and then check whether they come back in the discussion. So are there any discrepancies? So they see A in one experiment, but then something different in the other. Do authors discuss this? But also, if you're an expert, and ideally you are if you're reviewing, you will know the field. So you will know, okay, now they find this, but I know that someone else, or maybe even yourself, found something different. And that's okay. That's how science works. Sometimes you do see the different things if you do the same or similar experiment, but it should be at least in the discussion and it should be discussed. Do authors discuss the limitations, and do they put the work then in perspective and context of the field? This is where the field is. This is how our work contributes. This is how we now will move towards the future. And again, in the future perspective, authors might suggest experiments. It's not fair to ask them to really do all these experiments unless, again, you say, well, look, this is your hypothesis. You've now shown this, but the one critical experiment to disprove your hypothesis you've not done. That is an exception. But like, don't ask that they do everything until the treatment, for instance, is approved. That's just not realistic. So then for the disclosures, I think now there's more and more emphasis on transparency. If you don't know the reviewers, you might not know whether they have anything to disclose. Of course, if they're from a company, they should disclose that they're employees from a company. If there's people you know, you might know, well, they have patents or they are on this company advisory board, etc. Otherwise, you may not know, and then it's up to them to believe that they disclosed what they had to disclose. If you do know them and they forgot to disclose something, again, it's probably not intentional, but it's good to mention this. Like, well, I think the author forgot to disclose this and this. Is the relevant work cited? We mentioned that already. And then for the figures in the table, really check, were all the figures referenced, were the tables referenced, were they all clear? is everything required? Should it be a main table or a main figure, or is it something that can maybe go to the supplementary material? Is it needed at all? And also, are the legends clear? And I think for numbers of mice and statistical tests and things like that, ideally that is part of the legend. So that is where you can well, where you should find it. Mentioned this already, be nice. The fact that something is anonymous doesn't mean that you can be a troll and that you can be unfair to the reviewers. And also, like, it might have been something that has happened to you where you think, well, this reviewer really, really well, made me cry because they were so unfair. That doesn't mean that you should pay that forward to someone else. That should actually mean that you are nicer and try to not give other people that bad experience. So be nice, review like how you would like to be treated when you receive reviews. Be also fair, so point out their mistakes, point out errors, give suggestions, but be constructive. So say, well, this is how you can improve and be realistic. Explain, like, well, the authors have now they've drawn this conclusion, but I think this is wrong because of this and this, or I have a concern because, well, they've not done this experiments with I think is crucial because of this and this. It's really helpful for the editor and the authors if you say, well, these are major things, these are things that the authors really should include, and these are minor things like the typos, but also like, well, maybe they can consider to include this or that, where you think, well, it would be nice, but if they don't want to, well, then fine. If it's too sloppy, and I've had these as well, like if you read it and you think, well, this just doesn't make sense, well, I think as a non-native speaker, I can relate. We're not non-native speakers. It's difficult to write things in English. But if it's such poor quality that you just, that due to all the grammar mistakes, you can't even see what they mean, don't waste time trying to understand. Just email the editor and say, well, in this form, I cannot review this work. And I think in my career as a reviewer, that has happened, I think, only 2 or 3 times. So don't be reviewer 2. So reviewer 2 is the term for the reviewer. It's unfair. And I think also what I mentioned, like, it's okay to suggest a crucial experiment, but it's not okay to make all these weird suggestions just because you happen to like a specific technique, etc. So be fair, and don't be unrealistic to the review or to the authors. Also, so again, N of 1 things, case studies. Sometimes we can say, well, that's 1, that doesn't make sense. If it's exceptional enough, it's okay. And again, be fair. And I think this is the typical reviewer 2 comment. I'm afraid this manuscript may contribute not so much towards the field's advancements as much as towards its eventual demise. That's just not nice to hear. And I think there's better ways to say it, and probably it's also not fair. So you can make recommendations very often, and it differs per journal what classes they're in. You can say accept as is, and I think, again, in my career that has happened to me twice, that I submitted something and they said, well, you don't need to change it, it's good like this. It doesn't happen a lot. So when it does, celebrate it, but don't expect it to happen often. Except pending minor revision, that is what we all like, because then you can do it quick, and you know that if you manage that it will be accepted. Major revisions is of course not what we like to hear. But ideally the comments do make the paper better. And then sometimes some journals say, well, there's major revisions. We can look at it again, but it has to be submitted as a new paper. And this is not something that many journals have, but some do. And then there's, of course, the one that we really don't like, reject. But if something is really bad or flawed, where you say, well, but this doesn't make sense, and I'll give an example of something that I rejected in the past as a reviewer. If it doesn't make sense, it's okay to do it. But I always strive to try and see, can this be saved? Like, it may be not good in its current form, but is there a way that it can be made into such a form that it can be accepted and that it is okay. If you suggest revisions, ideally you also review the revised manuscript. And again, I'm saying this as an editor, it's really annoying as an editor when you get the revised manuscript back and then you ask the 3 reviewers that reviewed it in the past and all of them say, sorry, we don't have time, because then you need to find new reviewers and they will look at it for the first time. They will see the edits that were made by the authors, but they will also look at it with fresh eyes and they will say, look, well, we have, we agree that they implemented all these suggestions, but we have new comments and that's just not very nice for the authors and it slows things down. So ideally, if you suggest revisions, please also take the time to then look at how the authors implemented that. So feedback. So you will be asked to give feedback to the authors and to the editor. Well, to the authors, you need to be most elaborate. So outline what the paper is about, so they are sure that you actually looked at their paper. And again, you would assume this to be the case, but some people have to review lots of papers and they just copy paste the wrong thing into the wrong document. So it's always good to briefly outline what the paper is about so that everyone knows, okay, this comment fits to this paper. And it helps the editor to see whether you understood what the paper was about. Be nice. We've gone over this. Discriminate major and minor concerns, really helpful for the authors and the editor. And for the major concerns, provide the context. Why are things not okay? Why do they need to do this extra experiment? What is your concern? And don't be personal, but give constructive feedback. For the minor ones, you can really be brief, like on page what and what, they misspelled this word, or they didn't put the genes in italics, a very common one. Be brief, be constructive, and just list them, and then the authors can just quickly correct them. So to the editor, you can be very succinct. Sometimes you don't even need to. You can just say, well, look, everything is in the comments to the authors. Just read that, and that should tell you enough. But sometimes you need to elaborate and you need to give context, because the editor is, of course, not per se an expert in the field of this paper. They're just an expert in the general field. And sometimes there's something happening. There might be a controversy in the field. You might have to give the editor some context that the authors know, but the editor doesn't. So you might say, like, this concern really is very important because, well, there's camp A and camp B. Some people say it's this, some people say it's that. It's really important that they address this properly. There might be other things that the editor needs to be aware of. So there might be a model that the authors use where you say, well, they claim it's a very much used model, but actually it's not. Like those things, it's good to stress to the editor. And again, there's no need to repeat everything that you said to the author, also to the editor. They can read this feedback themselves as well. So some final considerations. If the authors report something that doesn't work, or if their hypothesis was wrong, so they have these what we call negative results, that is still something that advances science. So of course it's nice to, if there's a new discovery that gets you really excited, that's very cool. But if something doesn't work, that also advances science. So I urge you to also accept that, and then don't say, like, yeah, it's not going to be accepted for Cell or Science, but still it's important that it gets published. The same thing is because, well, this is the thing, that there's a publication bias for things that work. And that's not just because authors can't be bothered to write down when there's negative results. Well, not really negative results, but when something doesn't work. Reviewers play a role here too. And I know that because I've tried to publish negative results. They can be very critical and say, well, this is just not important for the field to know that something doesn't work. Yes, it is important to the field. Replication studies are important. So the fact that something has been shown in one lab and now people try to replicate it in a second lab, that is important information. Again, it's not going to be Cell, it's not going to be Science, but it's important that other people are able to do this, because we all know that a lot of publications, people try to replicate it and cannot. So the fact that someone can is important information. And ideally, of course, there's also a little bit of a new angle and some extra work, but even if there's not, this is important work. Also, don't automatically reject when someone is unable to replicate previous promising findings. The fact that it's not as easy as it looked is important information. And I think, so coming from the rare disease field, what we've had is where one lab saw that treatment X, Y, or Z worked in a mouse model, and based on that, clinical trials were started because they showed this, and then the trials failed, and then it turned out that 3 other labs had tried to replicate it, but they didn't succeed. Well, ideally, that work should have been published, because then no one would have wanted the clinical trials for these things. So these are things that we really want to avoid. So don't underestimate the importance of negative findings or things that don't work. And there's no reason to reject them because they don't work. Reject because the science isn't sound, reject because the hypothesis was not tested properly. Don't reject because the work was done properly. It was just not what people were expecting or hoping for. Now, I'm going to end with a personal anecdote of something that was rejected. And again, this is from the Duchenne field. So we have this MDX mouse model that is less strong because the mouse doesn't have dystrophin. And in this a publication, they treated it with a compound, and then they concluded, so group 1 was not treated and group 2 was treated, and they concluded that this treatment improved the strength. And if you look at this graph, well, you can say, well, yeah, that indeed, it does seem to have improved the strength. But then when you look in the methods, what you see is that all the animals in group 1 were female, and all the animals in group 2 were males. So what the authors did, they stratified based on sex, and they said, well, it's easy to discriminate. We're just going to not treat all the females, and then we're going to treat all the males. But of course, you can do that, but then can you conclude that the treatment is improving the strength, or might it just be that the fact that the group 2 animals were all males, that has affected strength? Of course, it's also possible that this treatment does improve strength on top of the males already being stronger, but there's no way you can figure that out if all the untreated mice were female and all the treated mice were male. So this is, I think, a clear example of sloppy science that should not be published. So I reviewed this, and I of course said, well, this is not how you should do it. If they want to draw this conclusion, they either should use only males or only females, or they should mix it, but they can't do it like this. And then I saw the comment from the other 2 reviewers, and they said the same thing. So this paper was rejected. Then 3 weeks later, I got invited to review a paper, and I recognized the title. It was the same publication. So I thought, well, it seems unrealistic that in 3 weeks' time they've redone the whole experiment with 2 months of treatment, and that they already have this new data, but maybe they were working on it already. Let's have a look. So the solution of the authors to this problem of them not treating the females, but treating the males, and then not being able to draw a proper conclusion, their solution to this was to just not mention that there were males and females involved. They were silent. So they removed, in the methods, they removed the fact that the females were not treated and the males were treated. They just didn't mention it at all. But of course, that's not fair. So then I emailed the editor and I said, well, look, I'm not going to review this paper, but I looked at it and this is what I know. This is not good science. And then the editor said, well, you're not the second person to email me about this. I'm going to reject this paper. And this was a big name in the neuromuscular field. I'm going to write to the editors or to the authors, that if I see this work published and I know that it's based on this, I will expose them. So this work was never published, which I think is fair. But it's also good that the editor took a stance there and said, like, this is not okay. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to ask or answer questions, but also if people have anecdotes or want to complain about unfair reviews, then now is the time.
Thanks a lot, Annemieke. So before we start complaining, maybe start with a few questions. So if you have a question for Annemieke, you can use the Q&A function. And I can start with a question. So what was maybe not covered during the webinar is who can actually review. So I think you mentioned that it should be an expert in the field, but what very often happens is that the review request goes to the very well-known professor of a big group, and then the professor sends the manuscript to a postdoc or a PhD student in the lab. They have a look at the manuscript, they send back their comments to the professor, and then maybe with some additional comments, or maybe even without any additional comments, this is submitted to a particular journal.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you think, or no, I think that I know the answer, but I think also the junior people should be awarded for the time spending on reviewing papers. And I think the other thing is, I think it's also good to do as a PhD student or a postdoc, because you learn a lot from this. So how do editors handle this?
Yeah, so I think there's now a couple of journals that actually say, look, if you're going to involve also your junior people in the review process, list them here so that they can get acknowledged for it. So they actively allow for this. There's also journals that very explicitly say, this is not okay. We ask you and only you, and if you want to involve someone else, contact us first, and then we'll discuss it, but don't share it with anyone. And of course, you have to adhere to that. You can not then send it to other people. So you have to be careful with that. I think so personally, so the only time that I will do a review with someone is when I think, okay, this is a good learning experience for them. I will review it, they will review it, and then we'll compare notes. And I would say, yes, also for PhD students, it's very useful to learn how to review a paper, but I would not. So if I get probably 5 to 10 requests per day to review work. I can't do all of that. Well, the ones that are not relevant, I just ignore. But the ones that are relevant, sometimes I think, oh, but I can't do this. But actually, this is something that's right in Ronald's alley. Then I'll just suggest them that they contact Ronald instead of me. And then Ronald can say yes or no. So that is usually how I try to do it, rather than just forward it to someone else and then taking credit for them. I don't think that is fair. And I think, the only time you should do it is if you know that they also get credit for it.
No, fully agree on that. So, Annemieke, do you think that there is a difference in reviewing scientific papers versus review papers?
Yes, because I think so with the scientific papers, you have to check, like, okay, what do they want to study? Did they do this properly? Are there experiments missing? And I see that Sepp asked a question. If there's an important experiment missing, would it be reasonable to ask them to acknowledge that they did not do this experiment? Yes, it would be very reasonable. Ideally, they do it. And if they say, well, we really can't, then they need to discuss that. So that is something that in a scientific paper, it's really about the methods, the results, the conclusions, and like how did all of this lead from one to another. In a review paper, again, so I think if you review a review, you again need to think, what is the topic? What would I expect that is discussed in this review? And then you can maybe say, well, something might be missing or something might be added. And you think, well, I didn't think of that, but yeah, that fits. But it's much more about then giving credit to everyone who's working in the field. So with a review paper, it's much more common that you say, well, you should really cite this, that, such and such paper. You should discuss this or that. That is much more common in a review paper than in a scientific paper. Because in a scientific paper, well, it's very focused, and then it doesn't make sense that they cite, well, everything else that is, well, remotely related to the field in a review paper, that might be more acceptable. But also with the review, bear in mind that your review papers likely will have some focus. So then it doesn't make sense. So just one example from a recent, so I was asked to write a review looking back to the development of nusinersen and eteplirsen. So antisense oligonucleotides for Duchenne and spinal muscular atrophy. And then the reviewer said, can you also provide a future perspective on the gene therapies for spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne? Well, no, the review was about antisense oligonucleotides and it was retrospective. So what they're now asking me is on 2 times. So I think then you can just say, well, that's beyond the scope of this review.
And on top of that, so do you agree, or what's your opinion about that when you have a scientific paper, it's all about the facts and things that you do show in your experiments, the hypothesis that you want to test. And what do you think that, for example, for a review paper, that it can be a little bit more your own opinion?
Yeah. And I think, of course, and then also it depends on what do the review authors say, because usually in the introduction, they will say, like, this is the purpose of this review. And then if they say, we want to give an accurate overview of everything that's happening, and then give their own opinion everywhere, well, no. But then there's, of course, also journals, expert opinion on this, on that, and such, where if there's no expert opinion, then you're really disappointed because you expect them to have an opinion. And then, for instance, Nucleic Acid Therapeutics also has these perspective paper. If a new oligo is approved, there's a perspective, and sometimes controversial things happen. Then there's a perspective where, as an author, you can be even a little bit provocative because, well, that's what they ask you to do. So it depends on the type of things. But yeah, in a review, I would like to read the opinion of the authors. And I think that is, and also it needs to make sense. So if there's a review on Duchenne exon skipping and I've never heard of the authors, then I'm like, well, are these the ideal people, or an expert opinion, are these the ideal people to write about this? Because I think if they're in this field, that I should probably be aware of their names.
Yeah. So you mentioned during the webinar that, for example, when you submit your paper, or when you're a reviewer for Cell or Nature, that you might want to suggest many more experiments, or that there is a bigger chance to suggest more and more elaborate experiments, and that's not the case for other kind of journals. So how do you determine what level of criticism or what level of something extras you need to add in your review?
So I think so. If you see the hypothesis at the beginning, you read the abstract, you see the hypothesis, they want to test this, then you can already think, okay, so how do they test whether this is right? How do they test whether this is wrong? And if they then only test whether it's right and they don't test whether it's wrong, well, for fundamental work, that's like, no, you really need to. And I think also another reason why they should just redo the experiment, if they didn't have negative controls, didn't have positive controls, and then they see nothing and they say, yeah, so this doesn't influence that. Well, if you have no positive control, if you have no negative, how do you know that your experiment worked? So then it's very fair to say, well, sorry, but you just have to redo this. Because you can't draw these conclusions. So those are reasons where you can say this is something that needs to be done. But for instance, if people have done a lot of work in a cellular system, to then say, and now you also have to test it in an animal model, where you know that they first have to make the animal model, that's just not realistic. And also there with Cell and Nature, like these papers where there is 100 supplementary figures, also it's just too much. And usually the sad thing is that there's so much results in there then that's condensed into short text that a lot of really important messages just get lost in the supplementary data. So what I don't like is people have salami slice one paper into 5 things where there's 1 figure per paper. That's not okay. But the way that things now are sometimes done with 100 figures, that's there's no way that people can process that amount of data in a short time. So I think the golden middle is probably best there. And again, it's up to you. And sometimes you think like, well, yeah, this experiment would be really nice, but I can see that, well, maybe it's beyond the scope. Or you can think, yeah, but you're now trying to publish it in Nature Medicine, then you should actually also do this, because what you have now is maybe a little bit thin for a journal of this standing. Yeah.
Yeah. Clear. So
And I think
along
just
this,
one more thing. So regardless of the impact factor of the journal, or regardless, like if it's sloppy science, it should not be published. Even if it's an impact factor 0.1, if it's sloppy science, it should not be published.
in the same line, you have, of course, many predatory journals.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether people are asked to review for these kind of journals, but how to recognize for what kind of journals you should do reviewing.
So I think, so I think this is so there's lists with predatory journals. So this is one thing that you can actually check. And sometimes it's challenging because there's some publishers that have predatory journals on their list, but some other journals from the same publisher are actually good and good quality. So then it's challenging. And if it's a journal where you say, well, I regularly read papers from this journal, I like these papers, they're good quality, and you're then asked to review, I mean, then you know the name of the journal, you can say yes. I think the predatory journals, well, the very common ones you will know, and I think the thing with predatory journals is that very often they will not ask you to review. They will ask you to submit your work and then pay a hefty open access publication fee, and they might use an AI bot to review your paper. So I think with predatory journal, you don't get that many questions to review work because they actually don't want criticism. They want things to be accepted as quickly as possible because that's how they make their money. There's of course some journals in between that do a sloppy job with reviewing and finding reviewers. And well, I showed this example of, and so this is one journal where every day I get 2 or 3 invitations to review for them. And this is not a predatory journal. This is a journal that pays editors to just review as much as they can, and then they just cast a very wide net. That doesn't make sense. So I will not review for anyone who invites me for something that's not in my field. Then you get on my blacklist, and people who've read my out of office reply will know this. You get on my blacklist, and I will just not review for you, because if you don't even like do the extra work to think, well, that I've actually never worked with some cell carcinoma, etc. And then, yeah, I'm also not going to review the relevant work for you because just by chance you now had a lucky hit. But I think this is so for predatory journals. Also, there's some of these. Are they predatory or not? So I would just say err on the side of caution, and at some point you will get enough invitations to review. So just say yes to the ones that have a good name that you know of. Like Nucleic Acid Therapeutics, always say yes. But just be aware. Yeah, be aware that some of these journals are iffy, and then it's better to say no.
So can you ask also things from the editor? So for example, when I get an invitation to review a paper and it's really on topic and really of interest to review, but I'm very busy for the coming 2 weeks because I know I have this grand deadline and I have to submit the paper myself. Can I then say, okay, I'm very happy to do the reviewing, but I can only do this not within your time frame, but happy to do this
Yeah.
within 2 weeks after the
Yeah,
deadline.
Yeah. No, so that is definitely something that you can ask, and editors are actually then very happy because then they know, okay, it's coming in. Well, it's okay that it takes slightly longer. This person wants to do it because they outline like, I'm busy now, but then I really want to do it. That's great. And those are things that you can ask. And I think this is the nice thing, that as an editor, people ask you things that you would never have thought to ask of an editor. So you know that if you're an editor, then you see what some people are asking. So asking for a slight extension, that is fine. And actually,
So,
like, the editors expect that most people will not be on time. But
so
try to
what
be
are
on
other
time.
questions?
But sorry.
So what are other wishes from reviewers that they ask to the editor?
What they ask. So sometimes sometimes, so it's not so much that they get invited. Sometimes people just say, I would really like to review in this field. Like, if you get papers on this or that, can you ask me? And well, that is tricky because, well, do you really like what? And of course, sometimes you think, yeah, okay, yeah, of course, you have a background in myotonic dystrophy, makes perfect sense that you ask for this. But sometimes it doesn't make any sense, and then it's like, well, okay, what is happening here? We've also had once with Journal of Neuromuscular Disease. So you asked as an author to suggest reviewers. So they suggested names that made sense, but then I looked at the email addresses, and these didn't make sense. So all these people that worked at Harvard, at St. Jude, etc., they suddenly all had Gmail addresses. So what they did, they just created a Gmail account so that they would then, on behalf of these experts, be reviewing the papers. Journals are getting
What did you do with the manuscript then?
reject. Wrote a strongly worded rejection letter and just said, okay, don't. And like these authors don't have to submit to that journal again. Like they're blacklisted by the publisher. Journals get more clever. So now the journal just has a system, like this name is connected to this individual. If you want to register a reviewer who's new, you have to put that in as an editor. They don't allow it to be automatically, which I think is fair.
Good. One final question, more for myself. You mentioned already the material methods section, and what I realize sometimes when I work with patients or patient material, actually, sometimes they ask you to provide the specifics per patient or patient tissue, so the age, the gender, the age of onset of a particular disease. And other journals ask you to have a group overview. So the average age, the average, the number of females, number of males. So what's your thoughts about that?
It will just, so it's usually just decided by the journal itself. And it's, so some journals are parts of society, like the NAT is part of the OTS. So if you have submitted a publication and there's no control oligos in your paper, then, well, you're not even going to be sent out for review, because that's not how we do it. We need our control oligos. And I think this is the same type of checkboxes that some others do, like, well, this is the information that we need, this is the information that we want. And then it depends. And this is the thing, that the first time that your paper is rejected and then they say, oh, just submit it to somewhere else, and you think, oh, that's easy. And then you realize, no, it's not easy at all. I need to rewrite this whole thing because suddenly now the methods need to be at the end. They have all these extra criteria and things. Yeah, that it's up to the journals to make these decisions. And so very often it's also not the editors that make these rules, but it's either the publisher or society that's liaised to yeah. So you have to deal with it.
Thanks a lot. So it's 6. So at least here in the Netherlands. So Erin, I give the word to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Annemieke, for that amazing talk. It's really helpful to get a perspective from someone who's experienced to try to weed out, because I know from my own experience that some of these like kind of predatory to the scale of annoying journals, they're getting smarter about the way that they're asking. And so I'm sure off record we're all willing to give people some feedback on what publishers are trustworthy and who aren't, and what kind of situations are like awkward. If you have personal kind of experience, I'm sure you can reach out to the three of us. And so I just want to thank you again, Annemieke, for giving us this great talk, and thank you everyone for attending.